Welcome to an exploration of something we rarely discuss with honesty: how our ancestors pursued altered consciousness, impossible beauty standards, and permanent transformation through methods that would shock modern sensibilities. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through three distinct worlds: ancient Egypt's sophisticated relationship with psychoactive substances, Renaissance Italy's deadly pursuit of aesthetic perfection, and Edo Japan's painful art of identity through tattoos. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to take a moment and settle in. Whether you're watching this late at night when the world is quiet, during a peaceful afternoon, or perhaps during your commute, you're now part of a global conversation that spans millennia. These stories connect us across continents and centuries, revealing truths about human nature that transcend time and culture. If you find yourself genuinely enjoying this exploration, I'd appreciate your subscription. But only if this content truly resonates with you. There's no pressure, no obligation. And please drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely fascinated by how these historical threads weave together people from Tokyo to Toronto, from Mumbai to Mexico City, creating conversations that our ancestors could never have imagined but would certainly understand. Now, dim your lights if you'd like. Get comfortable. Pour yourself a drink, ironically appropriate given our subject matter. And let's begin our journey with a civilization that perhaps came closest to perfecting the delicate art of sacred intoxication: the ancient Egyptians. Part 1. Egypt's pharmacological paradise. The Blue Lotus, more than just a pretty flower picture, if you will. The Nile Valley in 1400 BCE. The sun hammers down with relentless intensity, turning the air thick and shimmering. Along the fertile riverbank sustained by the life-giving floods that define Egyptian existence, a particular flower blooms in quiet pools and slow-moving water. To the untrained eye, it's simply beautiful, delicate blue petals opening to greet the dawn, closing again as Ra completes his daily journey across the sky. But to the ancient Egyptians, this flower, Nymphaea caerulea, the blue lotus, was something far more significant than mere botanical decoration. This was a gateway, a bridge between the mundane world of daily labor and the transcendent realm of the gods. The blue lotus wasn't discovered by accident. The Egyptians were keen observers of nature, and they noticed that certain flowers, when consumed in specific ways, produced profound changes in consciousness. The blue lotus contained alkaloids, a porphine and nuciferine, that modern chemistry has now identified and analyzed. These compounds produce mild euphoria, gentle relaxation, and what users describe as a dreamy, dissociative state where the boundaries between self and world soften and blur. The preparation method was both simple and time-consuming, which is often how the most profound rituals work. Dried lotus petals were carefully collected and steeped in wine for extended periods, sometimes for days. But this wasn't a quick infusion like making tea. This was a deliberate, patient process that allowed the alkaloids to fully saturate the alcohol, creating a beverage that was far more than the sum of its parts. The resulting drink appeared at festivals, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings where the boundary between human and divine needed softening. It was consumed communally, shared among friends and family, passed around tables where laughter and philosophical discussion mingled with the sweet, slightly bitter taste of the infusion. But what did it actually feel like? While we can't interview ancient Egyptians, historical accounts and modern recreations suggest a gentle, floating sensation, not the overwhelming intoxication of hard liquor or the disorientation of stronger psychedelics, but rather a subtle shift in perception. Colors became richer, more saturated. Music acquired deeper resonance, as if you could suddenly hear harmonies that had always been present but previously unnoticed. The weight of daily concerns, taxes, labor obligations, family conflicts lifted temporarily, replaced by a sense of cosmic connection and peaceful contentment. In tomb paintings throughout Egypt, from the Valley of the Kings to lesser-known burial sites, we see evidence of the lotus's central role in Egyptian culture. Pharaohs hold lotus flowers to their noses in formal portraits, the gesture capturing the moment of inhalation. Banquet scenes show guests passing flowers around communal tables, their poses suggesting the relaxed conviviality the lotus encouraged. Even the deceased are depicted with lotus blooms, suggesting the Egyptians believed these plants had value beyond death itself, perhaps easing the challenging journey into the afterlife or providing comfort in the eternal realm beyond. The association with the sun god Ra wasn't coincidental or arbitrary. The blue lotus exhibits a remarkable daily cycle. The flowers open at dawn, following the sun's path across the sky, then close again at dusk. This daily transformation, this death and rebirth mirroring the sun's own journey, made it a perfect symbol for the cyclical nature of existence, a concept absolutely central to Egyptian theology and their understanding of cosmic order. But here's where we need to be careful with our language and understanding. Calling this getting high in the modern recreational sense misses the cultural context entirely. For ancient Egyptians, consuming blue lotus wasn't escapism or mere pleasure-seeking. It was spiritual work. It was one of several methods for accessing different states of consciousness necessary for genuine religious experience, for touching the divine without the mediation of priests or temples. Priests prepared for important rituals using blue lotus. Ordinary people used it during festivals to participate more fully in communal worship. The altered state wasn't a bug in the system, it was the entire point. The Egyptians understood something that modern Western culture often struggles with, that consciousness is not a single, fixed state, but a spectrum, and different positions on that spectrum allow access to different types of knowledge and experience. The lotus represented transformation itself. From mud at the river bottom, the plant grows toward light, emerging into air and blooming into something beautiful. This journey from darkness to illumination paralleled the spiritual journey every Egyptian hoped to make, both in life and after death. Using the lotus wasn't just consuming a drug, it was participating in a metaphor, embodying a religious truth through direct experience. The feast of drunkenness, when getting obliterated, was religious duty. Every civilization has its holidays, its feast days, its times of celebration when normal rules are temporarily suspended. But few have approached this with the commitment or the honesty of ancient Egypt's feast of drunkenness. The name alone is refreshingly straightforward. No euphemisms here, no celebration of renewal or festival of joy. Just feast of drunkenness. The goal was explicit, the method was clear, and nobody pretended otherwise. The mythology behind this annual celebration reveals volumes about Egyptian values and their understanding of divine nature. The goddess Hathor, normally associated with love, joy, music, and motherhood, had a terrifying alternate form. According to myth, she once transformed into Sekhmet, a fearsome lioness deity whose rage threatened to destroy all of humanity. The gods, realizing they'd made a catastrophic error in unleashing her fury, devised a clever solution rooted in practical psychology and biochemistry. They flooded the fields with beer, thousands upon thousands of jars of beer, dyed red with pomegranate juice or ochre to resemble human blood. Sekhmet, in her blind rage, mistook this vast lake of beer for the blood of her victims. She drank and drank and drank. Eventually, she consumed so much that she passed out completely. When she finally awoke, her rage had dissipated, her bloodlust satisfied by nothing more than alcohol-induced unconsciousness. Humanity was saved through the tactical application of intoxicating beverages. To commemorate this divine intervention through inebriation, Egyptians gathered once annually for organized, sanctioned, religiously mandated intoxication. And let's be clear, this wasn't a refined wine tasting or a casual happy hour. This was structured ritual with a singular, explicit purpose to honor the delicate balance between destruction and preservation, to purge negative emotions and psychic toxins, and to renew one's connection to the cosmic order by literally drinking yourself into oblivion. The festival began at dawn because if you're going to spend an entire day getting progressively more drunk, you need to start early. Music filled the air. Drums, sistrums, metal rattles sacred to Hathor, lutes and voices raised in song. The ceremonial passing of drinks began almost immediately. Priests didn't discourage excess, they actively encouraged it. Drink as much as your heart desires wasn't advice, it was a religious commandment. The goal was to reach what Egyptians called a divine trance, which in practical terms meant drinking until you couldn't walk straight, lost your normal inhibitions entirely, or passed out completely in a temple courtyard surrounded by fellow worshippers in various states of consciousness. Participants sang songs praising Hathor. They danced through streets, their movements growing progressively less coordinated as the day wore on. They beat tambourines with enthusiasm that likely exceeded rhythm, and they claimed, genuinely believed, to see the goddess herself, whether these were authentic mystical experiences, alcohol-induced hallucinations, or simply the fervent hope of the deeply intoxicated meeting the power of collective belief. The distinction between religious experience and chemical intoxication probably didn't concern the Egyptians much. The altered state was the religious experience. There was no separation between the method and the meaning. Importantly, and this is crucial for understanding how different this was from modern drinking culture, this behavior carried absolutely no social stigma. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove, no shame, no guilt, no need for apologies. Getting drunk wasn't a moral failing, it was successful spiritual participation. In fact, if you woke up the morning after the feast of drunkenness with crystal clear memories of the entire event, your commitment to the divine was questioned. Why weren't you spiritually elevated, Kemetep? Do you perhaps hate the goddess? Are you secretly judging those of us who properly honored Hathor by vomiting behind the temple? Modern scholars, trying to make sense of this from our very different cultural perspective, describe the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal. They suggest it served important psychological functions, allowing people to release tensions, express emotions normally kept controlled, and reset their mental and emotional states. Ancient Egyptians might have agreed with this analysis, but they also would have insisted the goddess was genuinely present, that the divine actually descended into the gathering, and that something sacred occurred beyond mere social catharsis. The next day brought headaches, certainly. Regret about specific statements or actions, quite possibly. Perhaps a new scar shaped like an Anubis statue you fell against. But also, importantly, spiritual cleansing. The psychological slate wiped clean, the emotional poisons purged, a fresh start for the year ahead. This wasn't hedonism disguised as religion. It was religion expressed through what we'd now call hedonism, but which the Egyptians understood as a legitimate path to divine encounter. Beer. The liquid foundation of civilization. Now, before we get too romantic about Egyptian substance use, we need to talk honestly about their daily staple beverage. and we need to completely recalibrate our expectations about what beer meant in this context. Forget everything you know about beer. Erase from your mind any image of golden, carbonated liquid in a glass topped with white foam. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't remotely similar to anything you'd order at a modern bar or brewery. Egyptian beer was thick, genuinely thick, with a consistency somewhere between soup and porridge. It was murky and opaque, with chunks of solid material suspended throughout. It wasn't filtered, it wasn't clarified, it certainly wasn't carbonated. The technical term archaeologists use is bread beer, but let's be honest, this was liquid bread, or perhaps more accurately, bread that had lost its conviction and given up on being solid. The brewing process reveals everything about why the final product was so different from modern beer. Egyptians would take loaves of emmer wheat bread and partially bake them, not cooking them completely, but just enough to kill surface bacteria while leaving the interior somewhat raw. These partially baked loaves were then broken apart and soaked in water, creating a grain-water mixture that was basically dissolved bread soup. This mixture was then left to ferment, relying on wild yeasts present in the environment. The result, after days of fermentation, was a beige, chunky slurry that contained significant alcohol content along with substantial nutritional value from the unfermented grain matter still suspended throughout. And here's the crucial point. This beer wasn't just a social drink or an optional indulgence. It was practically a food group. It was a primary source of calories for most Egyptians, safer than water, which could carry parasites and bacterial diseases, and containing nutrients from the grain that help sustain people whose diets might otherwise be quite limited. Think about this. Workers building the pyramids, those massive stone structures that still stand today as testaments to Egyptian engineering, received daily beer rations as part of their payment. Not small symbolic amounts. We're talking about several litres per day, sometimes 3 to 4 litres per person. This means that much of ancient Egypt's greatest architectural achievements were accomplished by a workforce that was, by modern standards, perpetually buzzed. They were hauling multi-ton limestone blocks up ramps while mildly intoxicated. They were precisely fitting stones together with almost no mortar while slightly drunk. They were calculating angles and measurements with mathematics that still impresses us today, all while consuming enough beer daily to fail any modern workplace sobriety test. The alcohol content of Egyptian beer varied considerably, depending on brewing methods and fermentation time, but it generally wasn't as strong as modern beer, perhaps 3–4% alcohol by volume compared to modern beers that often run 5 to 7% or higher. However, the sheer quantity consumed more than compensated for lower potency. 3 litres of 3% beer still delivers substantial alcohol intake. But Egyptian beer was also a vehicle for other substances, particularly during festivals and religious rituals. The beer base could be enhanced with various additives, herbs for flavour and effect, spices for preservation and taste, and psychoactive plants when the occasion called for something more intense than ordinary intoxication. Mandrake root might appear in ceremonial batches, adding its own peculiar effect to the alcohol. Dates added natural sweetness and increased fermentation, boosting alcohol content. Frankincense and myrrh, substances we associate with religious offerings, could be added to beer, contributing their aromatic qualities and possibly their own subtle psychoactive properties. The social implications of this beer-centered culture were profound and reveal much about Egyptian society's structure. In a strictly hierarchical civilization, where displays of wealth through clothing and possessions were carefully regulated by law and custom, beer quality became a subtle but significant status marker. Common laborers drank basic, thick beer, nutritious and alcoholic, but fairly simple in formulation. Temple priests and nobility enjoyed more refined versions with carefully selected additives and longer fermentation times that produced clearer, stronger beverages. Pharaohs had dedicated royal breweries producing exclusive varieties that commoners would never taste, beers made with premium grain and exotic flavorings that demonstrated power through superior intoxication. Yet despite these quality differences, everyone drank beer. From the youngest children who received weaker, less fermented versions, to the elderly, from slaves to pharaohs, beer was universal. It was democracy in a cup, or more accurately, in a ceramic jar shared among friends, family, and co-workers. The communal aspect of beer consumption was central to its social function. People didn't typically drink alone at home. They drank together in groups, passing jars around, sharing the same vessel. This created bonds, reinforced social connections, and literally meant that people from different social strata occasionally shared the same drink, something that wouldn't happen with food or other beverages. Hygiene considerations made beer genuinely essential rather than merely preferred. The Nile River, while absolutely central to Egyptian life and prosperity, could carry parasites and bacterial pathogens. Drinking untreated water directly from the river was risky, but beer's fermentation process killed many dangerous microorganisms, making it genuinely safer than untreated water. So the ancient Egyptians weren't drinking beer constantly because they were hedonists or alcoholics, though individuals might have been, but because it literally kept them alive while also providing substantial daily calories. The fact that it also produced mild intoxication was perhaps a bonus, or perhaps another example of Egyptian wisdom in combining the practical with the pleasurable. Kaifi, the multi-sensory gateway. If Blue Lotus was Egypt's primary social lubricant and beer its nutritional and alcoholic foundation, then Kaifi represented something more complex, a multisensory spiritual technology that combined aromatic, medicinal, and psychoactive properties into a single preparation. Kaifi wasn't a single, standardized substance. It was a category of preparations, with recipes varying by temple, region, and time period. But certain common ingredients appeared frequently enough that we can reconstruct approximate formulas: myrrh, resin, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper berries, mint, frankincense, various aromatic plants, and additional resins from different trees. The preparation process was as important as the ingredients themselves. These materials weren't simply combined and burned, and they were mixed together, often with wine, and allowed to ferment, sometimes for weeks. This fermentation process broke down plant materials, released aromatic compounds, and created chemical interactions between ingredients that transformed the mixture into something qualitatively different from its components. After fermentation, the mixture was dried and formed into pellets or balls that could be stored and later burned slowly on hot coals. The result was smoke, thick, aromatic, consciousness-altering smoke that filled temple spaces with sensory intensity. The smell was genuinely extraordinary. Ancient descriptions and modern recreations using historical recipes suggest an aroma that's simultaneously sweet, spicy, resinous, and floral, complex and layered, changing as different components reached their combustion temperatures and released their distinctive scents into the air. But Kaifi wasn't just about pleasant smells. The aromatic compounds affected mood and consciousness directly through inhalation. Some components contained mild psychoactive substances. Others produced effects through what we'd now call aromatherapy, direct neurological responses to specific scent molecules. When burned in enclosed temple spaces with poor ventilation, and Egyptian temples deliberately lacked windows and airflow, creating darkness broken only by lamp and firelight, Kaifi created an atmosphere that fundamentally altered the sensory experience of worship. Religious ceremonies involve priests waving censers of burning kaifi through temple halls, enveloping worshippers in clouds of sweet-smelling smoke. Prolonged exposure, especially in enclosed spaces, likely produced lightheadedness, mild euphoria, heightened suggestibility, and altered perception, precisely the mental states conducive to religious revelation and mystical experience. The effects were cumulative. As smoke accumulated in enclosed spaces and participants breathed it continuously for hours during ceremonies, the psychoactive and aromatic compounds built up in their systems. What began as pleasant smell transformed into full sensory immersion. Kaifi had practical applications extending beyond ritual use. It was considered medicinal, prescribed for respiratory ailments, somewhat ironically, given that treatment involved inhaling smoke. It aided sleep, presumably through its calming and mildly sedating properties. It was even claimed to ward off snakes, though the mechanism for this was unclear. Perhaps snakes disliked the smell, or perhaps people too intoxicated by kaifi smoke simply stopped noticing snakes. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian, writing centuries after Egypt's classical period, claimed that kaifi could induce dreams and visions. This makes perfect pharmacological sense if recipes included psychoactive ingredients alongside aromatic ones. The combination of multiple active compounds in smoke form, inhaled over extended periods, could absolutely produce visionary experiences. The production of kaifi was itself ritualized. Recipes read like alchemical formulas, specifying not just ingredients and proportions, but precise timing requirements, moon phases for mixing, and prayers to be recited during production. Creating kaifi wasn't cooking, it was sacred chemistry, the transformation of ordinary plants into tools for divine communication. Some recipes were remarkably complex. 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific astronomical conditions. The most elaborate formulations required months to complete properly. Honestly, it's somewhat amazing that Egyptian priests accomplished anything else, given how much time apparently went into perfume production. But once lit, kaifi's aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signaling to everyone within smell range that something holy was happening, or at least that someone was engaging in serious incense enthusiasm. In tombs, archaeologists regularly find kaifi among burial goods, suggesting its importance extended beyond life. The afterlife apparently required good-smelling smoke too, either for the deceased's continued enjoyment or to mask the odors of mummification, or possibly both. Death was no reason to stop appreciating fine aromatic preparations. Mandrake, respect the root or face the consequences. Among Egypt's extensive pharmacological arsenal, mandrake occupies a special category, a plant requiring both knowledge and courage to use, existing in that dangerous zone where medicine and poison overlap so completely that the distinction becomes meaningless. Mandrake root, Mandragora officinarum, contains powerful tropane alkaloids, particularly scopolamine and atropine, compounds that affect the nervous system in unpredictable and potentially lethal ways. The dose-response curve for mandrake is steep and unforgiving, meaning that small changes in amount consumed produce dramatically different effects. In carefully measured small doses, mandrake could relieve pain, reduce anxiety, promote sleep, and reportedly function as an aphrodisiac, a combination of effects suggesting the Egyptians understood its capacity to alter both physical sensation and mental state simultaneously. In slightly larger doses, mandrake produced hallucinations, delirium, confusion, and loss of muscle control. Users might experience terrifying visions, convinced that reality itself was dissolving around them. Their perceptions became entirely unreliable, with hallucinated events seeming as real as actual occurrences. In still larger doses, and the margin between larger and slightly larger wasn't generous, mandrake could cause cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, coma, and death. There was no antidote, no reversal agent, no safety net. Overdose simply killed you, usually unpleasantly. The Egyptians knew this. Medical papyri list mandrake carefully and specifically, prescribing it for particular conditions: chronic pain that other remedies couldn't touch, severe insomnia resistant to less dangerous treatments, and as an aphrodisiac for situations where sexual function needed pharmaceutical assistance. But mandrake's reputation extended far beyond straightforward medicine. Its forked roots bore vague resemblance to human figures: 2 legs, sometimes what could be interpreted as arms. This anthropomorphic quality led to folklore suggesting the plant possessed consciousness, awareness, perhaps even a soul. Later traditions, possibly rooted in Egyptian practices but definitely elaborated in medieval Europe, held that pulling mandrake from the ground caused it to shriek, a scream so terrible that anyone hearing it would be driven instantly insane or simply die on the spot from the horror of it. The supposed solution to this harvesting problem was simultaneously practical and deeply strange. Tie a rope around the mandrake root, attach the other end to a dog, cover your ears thoroughly, and let the unfortunate canine yank the plant free while you remain safely out of auditory range, and the dog might die or go mad from the mandrake's scream, but at least you'd have your medicinal root. Whether ancient Egyptians actually believed in screaming plants and employed canine sacrifices for botanical harvesting remains unclear. Archaeological evidence for this specific practice is lacking, but they certainly treated mandrake as more than a simple herb requiring ordinary precautions. Mandrake appeared in magical contexts, rituals aimed at producing specific outcomes rather than treating physical ailments. It featured in fertility rites, its human-shaped root and aphrodisiac properties making it symbolically appropriate for ceremonies intended to promote conception. It was used in preparations designed to induce prophetic dreams, that liminal state between sleep and waking where divine messages supposedly became accessible. The line between medicine, magic, and poison with mandrake was essentially non-existent. Too little achieved nothing beneficial, too much killed you. Getting the dose precisely right, threading that narrow needle between insufficient and fatal, required genuine expertise, years of training, and probably careful, experimental observation that we'd prefer not to think about too deeply. This expertise made mandrake the domain of priests and specialized healers, people who'd undergone extensive training and who theoretically understood what they were doing. These weren't folk remedies that anyone could mix up at home. This was advanced pharmacology, ancient Egyptian style, effective when used correctly, deadly when used carelessly. When mandrake appears in Egyptian temple and medical contexts, it's often associated with transformation, appropriate for a substance that could transform pain into relief, wakefulness into sleep, ordinary consciousness into something profoundly strange, and life into death depending on dosage. Cannabis and opium, the international pharmacy, not all of Egypt's psychoactive and medicinal substances were native plants. Trade routes brought foreign botanicals with profound effects, expanding the Egyptian pharmacopoeia beyond local species. Cannabis appears in Egyptian medical texts under various names, Shemshemet being one possibility, though ancient botanical naming is often ambiguous and subject to scholarly debate. It was prescribed primarily for inflammation, eye problems, possibly glaucoma, given cannabis's ability to reduce intraocular pressure, and notably gynecological conditions. Yes, ancient Egyptian women may have used cannabis suppositories for menstrual pain and possibly childbirth, remedies that sound surprisingly modern until you remember that effective treatments are effective regardless of era. If cannabis reduces pain and inflammation, then applying it where pain and inflammation occur makes logical sense whether you're in 1400 BCE or 2025 CE. The Egyptians didn't emphasize recreational cannabis use in surviving records, at least not explicitly, but they clearly understood its properties beyond pure analgesia. Cannabis was processed into oils mixed with honey to improve palatability and perhaps slow absorption, and combined with other herbs in complex preparations whose full effects we can only speculate about. Whether some preparations were smoked or inhaled remains academically debated. The technology for smoking certainly existed, pipes and braziers were common, but direct textual evidence for cannabis smoking in ancient Egypt is limited. What we do have is strong evidence for topical and oral administration, along with the tantalizing possibility that temple incense occasionally included cannabis alongside frankincense and myrrh. Imagine participating in a ceremony where you'd consumed blue lotus wine. You were breathing air thick with kaifi smoke, and perhaps, just perhaps, that incense mixture also contained cannabis. The synergistic effects of multiple psychoactive substances working simultaneously could produce experiences far beyond what any single component achieved alone. Residue analysis of mummies has revealed traces of cannabis in some cases, suggesting several possibilities: medicinal use shortly before death, cannabis-containing preparations used during mummification, or inclusion of cannabis in burial practices. Interpretation depends on where in the mummy the residues are found and what other substances accompany them. Opium arrived in Egypt from the eastern Mediterranean, particularly Cyprus, through well-established trade networks. By the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, poppies and their potent derivatives had become established parts of Egyptian medicine. The Egyptians recognized opium's power to erase pain, calm coughs, soothe gastrointestinal distress, and induce sleep so deep it bordered on unconsciousness. They administered it in multiple forms: drinks where opium was dissolved in wine or beer, pills made from opium mixed with other substances and formed into tablets, and suppositories. Because, as we've established, Egyptians had no hesitation about alternative delivery methods. But opium had religious dimensions beyond pain management. Its ability to create profound euphoria and dissociative states made it suitable for certain rituals, particularly those involving communication with the dead or symbolic journeys to the underworld. When you're trying to contact deceased ancestors or visit Osiris's realm, being completely sober might actually be counterproductive. A significant opium dose could facilitate the required altered state. Elite Egyptians had substantially greater access to these imported substances, while common people could obtain locally available plants like blue lotus, affording rare, imported poppies and premium cannabis preparations required wealth. Even in death, these distinctions persisted. Tombs of nobles and royalty contained more exotic substances and more elaborate pharmacological preparations for the afterlife journey. Tutankhamun's tomb, famously discovered relatively intact, contained wine, oils, unguents, and numerous aromatic substances. Analysis of some containers revealed ingredients that had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles to reach Egypt, demonstrating the young pharaoh's access to an international pharmacy even in death. Wine, divinity in a jar beer, was democratic and universal, but wine was exclusive, and that exclusivity transformed it from mere beverage into status symbol and religious necessity. Egypt produced wine, though not as successfully as grape-growing regions to the north around the Mediterranean. Egyptian climate wasn't ideal for viticulture. This scarcity increased wine's value and prestige exponentially. Wine appeared at elite gatherings, royal ceremonies, and religious festivals honoring specific gods, particularly Osiris, the god of agriculture, rebirth, and the afterlife. Egyptian wine wasn't simply fermented grape juice consumed straight. Like beer, it served as a base for other ingredients, transforming from alcoholic beverage into delivery system for psychoactive botanical preparations. Blue lotus petals soaked in wine created a potent combination where alcohol and lotus alkaloids enhanced each other's effects, a pharmacological synergy that produced experiences qualitatively different from either substance alone. The alcohol increased the bioavailability of the alkaloids, making them more readily absorbed. The lotus alkaloids added dimensions to the intoxication that alcohol alone couldn't achieve. Myrrh and frankincense could be added to wine, contributing their distinctive flavors along with possible psychoactive properties. These resins contain compounds that affect mood and consciousness when consumed rather than simply burned as incense. Some wine recipes included mandrake, creating beverages that were genuinely dangerous, alcohol, lotus alkaloids, and tropane alkaloids, all working simultaneously on the central nervous system. These weren't drinks for casual consumption. These were sacramental preparations intended to produce profound alterations of consciousness for specific religious purposes, and these infused wines appeared prominently at the Feast of Drunkenness and other celebrations where transcendence through intoxication was the explicit goal. The mixture of multiple psychoactive substances produced effects that neither alcohol nor any single plant alone could achieve. What modern pharmacology calls synergistic effects, where combined substances produce results greater than the sum of individual effects. Wine also served as religious offering, something given to gods rather than consumed by humans. Jars were ritually poured at temple altars, left in tombs for the deceased's journey, and used in ceremonies invoking divine presence. The assumption underlying these practices was that gods appreciated fine wine and altered states as much as humans did, or perhaps that the boundary between human and divine could be crossed more easily when both parties were intoxicated. Interestingly, the Egyptians developed a wine classification system remarkably sophisticated for its era. They noted wine origin, vintage year, and quality grade. Certain vineyards produced superior wine, and this distinction mattered enormously in social contexts. Serving premium wine at a banquet demonstrated wealth, taste, and social status. Serving mediocre wine was embarrassing and potentially damaging to one's reputation. Wine jar labels surviving from ancient Egypt read like modern wine labels. Year 17, good wine from the estate of Pharaoh in the Western River. This attention to provenance and quality reveals a culture that took its intoxicants seriously and understood that the source and preparation method dramatically affected the final experience. Trance states and divine possession. When the gods drop in, Egypt's various chemical preparations supported something deeper and more complex than simple intoxication, a culture that actively valued altered consciousness as a path to truth and divine knowledge. Divine possession in Egypt wasn't an emergency requiring exorcism, it was an achievement, a goal actively pursued by priests and priestesses who trained for years to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming divine beings into their bodies temporarily during rituals and ceremonies. Temple dancers and priestesses specifically cultivated trance states through sophisticated combinations of techniques, rhythmic movement designed to alter brainwave patterns, repetitive music that induced dissociative states, sleep deprivation that lowered psychological defenses, extended fasting that changed brain chemistry, and yes, psychoactive substances that opened consciousness to alternative experiences. When a priestess began speaking in an altered voice during ceremony, her posture changing dramatically, her personality apparently replaced by something or someone else, observers didn't call physicians or attempt interventions. They listened carefully. These moments were understood as direct, divine communication, messages from gods delivered through human vessels temporarily vacated for divine occupation. The methods for inducing possession trance were systematic and reproducible. Drummers maintained specific rhythms known through trial and error to alter consciousness. The beat wasn't arbitrary or simply musical, it was neurological technology, rhythm calibrated to affect brain function. Dancers moved in prescribed patterns, spinning or swaying in ways designed to produce dissociation and vertigo. The movements weren't random expressions of joy, they were techniques methodically developed over centuries to reliably produce altered states. Smoke from kaifi filled the air, creating an atmosphere thick with psychoactive and aromatic compounds. Participants had typically consumed wine, beer, or lotus preparations before ceremonies began. All these elements combined, rhythm, movement, sleep deprivation, fasting, smoke inhalation, and psychoactive substances, created conditions where trance and possession became not merely possible but probable. The effects were cumulative and synergistic. Any single element might produce minor changes in consciousness. All elements working together produced profound alterations, states where participants' sense of individual identity dissolved, where they felt merged with something larger, where voices that weren't their own seemed to speak through them. Documentation describes possessed individuals exhibiting dramatic changes, altered posture and gait, voices pitched differently and using archaic language, prophetic utterances that seemed beyond their normal knowledge, and complete amnesia for the possession experience afterward. They would return to normal consciousness hours later with no memory of what they'd said or done while the god was present. Whether this resulted from psychological suggestion, psychoactive substance effects, dissociative neurological states, actual divine intervention, or some combination of all these factors depends entirely on your worldview and metaphysical assumptions. To the Egyptians, distinguishing between these potential explanations would have seemed unnecessary or even meaningless. The message mattered, the mechanism was secondary. Importantly, both men and women could channel divinity, though different gods showed preferences for different vessels. Hathor typically possessed women. Horus might choose either gender. This gave female religious specialists particular authority. A possessed priestess spoke with divine power that superseded normal gender hierarchies and social conventions. When the priestess of Hathor declared something while possessed, she wasn't offering a woman's opinion subject to male approval or dismissal. She was transmitting Hathor's direct communication, carrying the goddess's full authority. Kings and nobles consulted possessed priestesses before major decisions, accepting their pronouncements as genuinely divine guidance. The trance wasn't always voluntary either. Documentation describes cases of the afflicted, individuals seized by deities unexpectedly, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and requiring substantial quantities of incense to manage the experience. Whether these were actual divine messages or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of kaifi smoke next to a flaming brazier while sleep-deprived and mildly intoxicated remains a subject of scholarly debate. Once the trance ended, the possessed individual returned to normal consciousness, typically looking disoriented, exhausted, and drenched in sweat. The ritual concluded with applause from witnesses, a sip of sacred wine to ground the person back in ordinary reality, and possibly a nap behind a pillar while someone else cleaned up any mess created during the possession episode. To modern eyes, informed by psychology and neuroscience, divine possession might look like performance art, meeting heat stroke, dissociative episodes, or even epileptic seizures being reinterpreted through religious frameworks. But to ancient Egyptians, possession was the pinnacle of religious experience, the moment when the boundary between human and divine collapsed entirely, allowing direct communication and revelation. Death and the afterlife. Packing the essentials. Egyptian attitudes toward psychoactive substances reached their logical conclusion in burial practices, revealing assumptions about consciousness, pleasure, and the nature of existence after death. Tombs weren't just repositories for corpses, they were furnished residences for the soul, homes equipped with everything the deceased might need for eternal existence. And what does a soul need? According to Egyptians, food, clothing, furniture, servants, represented by Ushabti figurines, and apparently substantial quantities of drugs. Blue lotus petals appear in burial contexts so frequently that their presence became almost standard. Wine jars accompany the dead in tombs ranging from royal to relatively modest. Kefi and other incenses are buried alongside bodies. Some tombs contain sealed vessels whose contents have degraded beyond identification, mystery preparations that might have been medicinal, psychoactive, or both. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered relatively intact by Howard Carter in 1922, contained not just gold treasures, but practical supplies, wine jars still sealed after 3,000 years, oils and unguents in alabaster containers, aromatic substances including what appeared to be kai-fi or similar preparations. This wasn't unusual, just remarkably well preserved because tomb robbers hadn't emptied everything. Even modest burials included basic provisions. Archaeological excavations of non-royal tombs regularly reveal beer jars, food offerings, and small containers that likely held oils or medicinal preparations. The scale varied by wealth, but the principle remained constant across social classes. The reasoning was practical from an Egyptian perspective. The soul needed nourishment in the afterlife. If Blue Lotus helped one commune with gods in life, surely it served the same purpose in death, perhaps even more so, given that the deceased existed in closer proximity to divine beings. If wine facilitated joy and social connection among the living, the dead deserved continued access to these pleasures. Some tomb paintings depict the deceased at eternal banquets, lotus flowers held gracefully, wine flowing abundantly. These images weren't metaphorical or aspirational. They represented the dead person's ongoing experience as Egyptians understood it, forever young, forever feasting, forever enjoying the pleasures they'd known in life, now extended eternally. The opening of the mouth ceremony performed on mummies and statues of the deceased ritually restored the dead person's ability to eat, drink, breathe, and speak. This ceremony was considered essential. Without it, the soul couldn't interact with the physical provisions placed in the tomb. You can't enjoy your burial stash of lotus wine if your mouth remains ritually sealed, after all. This cultural practice reveals profound assumptions about consciousness and pleasure. Egyptians saw altered states and physical pleasures not as sins requiring atonement or temptations to be resisted, but as fundamental aspects of existence, valuable enough to ensure their continuation beyond biological death. The afterlife, as Egyptians conceived it, wasn't primarily about moral judgment, though that element existed with the weighing of the heart against Mahat's feather. It was about continuation, taking the best aspects of life and extending them eternally. If substances that altered consciousness and produced pleasure were valuable in life, they remained valuable in death. Power, priests, and the politics of consciousness. Understanding who controlled access to psychoactive substances reveals crucial dynamics of power in Egyptian society. Temples weren't merely religious centers, they were economic powerhouses that owned vast agricultural lands, employed thousands of workers, and produced goods ranging from bread to the complex substances we've discussed. Blue lotus cultivation, kefi production, brewing operations, wine production, these were temple industries, and priests controlled them comprehensively. This control gave religious authorities enormous soft power, extending far beyond official positions. If the gods spoke through drug-induced visions and priests determined who received which substances when and in what combinations, then priests effectively controlled divine communication. Political power and spiritual authority became functionally inseparable. Pharaohs, despite their divine status, depended on priestly support. The king might wear the double crown and command armies, but priests interpreted omens, conducted crucial legitimizing rituals, and managed the infrastructure of belief that made royal rule acceptable to the population. When those same priests also controlled consciousness-altering substances, their influence extended into the most intimate aspects of human experience, how people felt, what they saw, which realities they could access. Common people weren't entirely excluded from these experiences. Beer was universal and accessible. Public festivals brought moments of sanctioned intoxication where normal rules temporarily suspended, but the more potent substances, refined preparations, optimal dosages, to knowledge of proper combinations and timing, remained restricted to elites and religious specialists who'd undergone years of training. We might call this gatekeeping or knowledge hoarding. Egyptians would have called it proper order, maintaining Mahat, the cosmic balance. The hierarchical structure reflected their understanding of universal organization, gods at the apex, Pharaoh as divine embodiment below them, priests as intermediaries facilitating communication, nobles managing practical affairs, and common people forming the base. Access to divine experiences through substances followed this same pyramidal structure. Yet this system functioned remarkably well for over 3,000 years, one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Egypt produced stunning artistic achievements, mathematical and astronomical knowledge, architectural wonders, and a complex literature. Whether the psychoactive substances enabled these achievements, merely accompanied them, or were completely incidental remains impossible to determine conclusively. What's clear is that substances were present throughout in religious ceremonies, social gatherings, medical treatments, and burial practices. They were woven into the fabric of Egyptian culture so thoroughly that separating them from other aspects of civilization becomes essentially artificial. Conclusions on ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt's relationship with psychoactive substances was sophisticated, systematic, and deeply integrated into religious and social structures. They weren't recreational users in the modern sense. Their use was intentional, controlled, and connected to larger spiritual and communal purposes. But they were also undeniably human. Behind the elaborate rituals and theological justifications, people sought experiences we still seek today: relief from pain and suffering, connection with others and with something greater than themselves, transcendence of ordinary consciousness limitations, joy and pleasure in existence. The Blue Lotus wasn't merely a sacred symbol, it genuinely made people feel good, producing mild euphoria and peaceful dissociation. The Feast of Drunkenness wasn't purely theological exercise, it was also tremendously fun, offering sanctioned release from normal constraints. Kaifi didn't just honor gods, it created beautiful, immersive sensory experiences that were enjoyable in themselves. Egypt demonstrates that humans have always sought altered states, and that societies can structure this seeking in ways serving communal purposes rather than undermining social cohesion. Whether modern approaches have improved on their model remains debatable. We've certainly developed more potent substances and faster delivery methods. Whether we've developed wiser frameworks for integrating these substances into healthy social structures is far less certain. The Egyptians understood something we often forget, that consciousness exists on a spectrum, that different states access different types of knowledge and experience, and that the boundary between medical, recreational, and spiritual use is largely artificial, a distinction our categories impose rather than one existing naturally in human experience. Part 2. Renaissance? Beauty and its deadly price. Introduction: when appearance became everything. Let's leap forward over 2 millennia and west across the Mediterranean to Renaissance Italy, Florence, Venice, Rome, during the 1400s and 1500s. This was a world exploding with artistic genius, intellectual ferment, and unprecedented wealth concentration. It was also a world where beauty standards became literal killers, where the pursuit of aesthetic perfection destroyed bodies systematically and deliberately. If ancient Egypt showed us consciousness alteration as spiritual practice, Renaissance Italy will show us body modification as social necessity, transformation pursued not for religious transcendence but for status, marriage prospects, and survival in ruthlessly competitive social hierarchies. The ideal Renaissance woman had specific, exacting physical characteristics: skin like alabaster or fine porcelain, pure white, utterly pale, unmarred by any sun exposure whatsoever, a high, rounded forehead suggesting intelligence and nobility, tiny waist and smooth, elongated silhouette, delicate features and refined movements, and, most importantly, the appearance of effortless perfection, as if all this required no work, no pain, no sacrifice. The reality, of course, was precisely opposite. Achieving and maintaining this appearance required constant work, considerable pain, and genuine sacrifice, sometimes including life itself. The White Death, lead-based beauty. Ceruse was the foundation of Renaissance beauty, quite literally. It was the base layer upon which everything else was built, and ceruse was poison. And the recipe was straightforward: white lead, lead carbonate, mixed with vinegar to form a paste, then applied thickly to face, neck, and chest. The goal was to achieve that coveted ghostly pallor, indicating nobility, freedom from outdoor labor, distance from peasant life. Tanned or naturally colored skin indicated manual work under the sun, marking you as lower class regardless of your actual status or wealth. Therefore, porcelain pallor became essential for any woman claiming or aspiring to nobility. Application was intensive and time-consuming. Women started with clean skin, or as clean as infrequent bathing allowed, then spread ceruse paste evenly across visible areas. The initial layer was foundation. Additional layers followed, building up thickness gradually until skin appeared uniformly white, smooth, and almost translucent. The coverage needed to be complete and flawless. Any natural skin tone showing through suggested inadequate application or, worse, inability to afford sufficient ceruse. So women applied multiple thick layers, creating a mask-like surface that cracked when facial expressions moved too dramatically. Some women slept in ceruse, refusing to wash their faces for days or weeks, allowing the lead to truly penetrate their skin. When sores inevitably developed from this practice, the solution was obvious to them: apply more ceruse to cover the lesions. This created vicious cycles where lead poisoning symptoms were treated with more lead, accelerating the deterioration. Lead poisoning symptoms appeared gradually, making causation difficult to recognize in an era lacking modern toxicology. Initial symptoms were relatively minor: persistent headaches, digestive disturbances, unusual fatigue. These could be attributed to many causes, so women rarely connected them to their cosmetics. As exposure continued over months and years, more serious symptoms emerged. Skin began genuinely deteriorating, not just cosmetic problems but actual tissue breakdown. Sores that wouldn't heal appeared and spread. Hair thinned dramatically and fell out in clumps. Teeth loosened in their sockets, sometimes falling out entirely. Cognitive function declined as lead accumulated in neural tissue, causing confusion, memory problems, and personality changes. Eventually, lead accumulated in bones and major organs, causing systemic failure. Kidneys struggled to process the toxin. The liver showed damage. Reproductive systems were affected, leading to miscarriages and stillbirths. Death, when it came, was often attributed to other causes, wasting disease or melancholia, or simply mysterious decline, rarely to cosmetics. But before death, ceruse delivered on its promise. It created flawless, pale skin that contemporaries genuinely described as angelic or divine. Portrait paintings from the era show this aesthetic clearly. Women with ghostly white faces, unnatural smoothness, and an otherworldly quality. They look ethereal because they were literally slowly dying, their bodies gradually poisoned by their pursuit of beauty. Curie joined lead in the Renaissance beauty arsenal, creating a toxic 1-2 punch. Mercury was used to remove blemishes, fade age spots, and supposedly cure syphilis, which was epidemic in Renaissance Europe following its introduction from the Americas. Curie was applied topically in ointments or even ingested in pills, accumulating in the body just as lead did. Mercury is neurotoxic, affecting the central nervous system and causing tremors, cognitive decline, mood changes, and eventually severe neurological damage. Combined with lead cosmetics, mercury created compound poisoning that accelerated deterioration dramatically. The class implications were stark and deeply ironic. Only wealthy women could afford extensive ceruse use. It was expensive, requiring imported materials and skilled preparation. Peasant women had naturally colored, healthy skin because they couldn't afford to poison themselves. So nobility demonstrated status by deliberately destroying their health, wearing their toxicity as a badge of privilege. Some physicians did warn against these practices. Medical texts from the period occasionally mention cosmetics dangers. But these warnings were largely ignored, drowned out by social pressure and beauty standards that trumped health concerns completely. A few moralists condemned vanity itself, arguing that excessive attention to appearance indicated spiritual corruption. But their arguments failed against overwhelming social pressure. If every successful woman in your social circle wore ceruse, refusing it meant social suicide. Slower than lead poisoning, perhaps, but equally terminal to marriage prospects and social standing. Plucking toward perfection. The war on natural hair. If lead-white skin formed the canvas, hair removal created the frame. Renaissance. Italian women didn't just style their hair, they systematically removed it, reshaping their hairlines and faces according to rigid, aesthetic standards. The ideal look featured a high, rounded forehead. The higher, the more aristocratic and intelligent you appeared. Natural hairlines didn't typically provide this, so women plucked them back, removing hair along the forehead's natural edge to push the hairline back by an inch or more. This wasn't subtle modification. This was aggressive, repeated hair removal using tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells to grip and rip out individual hairs. The process was exactly as painful as it sounds, creating a red, inflamed skin area that needed. This wasn't subtle modification. This was aggressive, repeated hair removal using tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells to grip and rip out individual hairs. The process was exactly as painful as it sounds, creating a red, inflamed skin area that needed hiding with, you guessed it, more ceruse. Eyebrows received similar treatment, but even more extreme. The ideal was barely visible brows, thin shadows suggesting where eyebrows might theoretically exist rather than actual functional facial hair. Some women removed eyebrows completely, leaving smooth skin that would later be decorated with delicate painted lines. The maintenance schedule was relentless. Hair grows back continuously. So plucking had to be repeated regularly, weekly at minimum, more frequently for fastidious fashion followers. This meant hours of painful hair removal weekly, year after year, gradually damaging follicles and creating permanent changes to hair growth patterns. For stubborn hair that resisted plucking, chemical warfare was deployed. Mixtures containing walnut oil, arsenic, or quicklime, calcium oxide, were applied to weaken regrowth and damage follicles. Yes, arsenic, the famous poison, applied deliberately to facial skin because beauty standards demanded it. These chemical depilatories worked through corrosion, essentially burning hair away along with whatever skin they contacted. Application required precision and luck. Too much or too long, and you'd have chemical burns requiring weeks to heal, which of course necessitated even more ceruse to hide the damage. For particularly persistent individual hairs, there was always fire. Women literally burned away stray hairs with candle flames, risking burns, singed skin, and permanent scarring. The smell of burning hair became a common background note in wealthy women's chambers, mingling with perfumes in grotesque olfactory combinations. This entire process typically occurred without good mirrors. High-quality mirrors were expensive luxuries. Most women relied on polished metal surfaces that gave distorted, unclear reflections. So hairline plucking and eyebrow removal happened largely by feel or with servants' assistants, which explains why period portraits sometimes show somewhat uneven or patchy results. Try for a moment to imagine precisely shaping your hairline without seeing it clearly while experiencing significant pain, knowing that errors would be visible for weeks. The skill and pain tolerance required were genuinely remarkable. Body hair elsewhere was similarly offensive to Renaissance sensibilities. Hair on arms, legs, and more intimate areas marked women as insufficiently refined, too close to animals. So depilatory mixtures, vinegar, quicklime, arsenic in various combinations were applied to remove all visible body hair. These concoctions burned intensely. Application wasn't pleasant. They often caused scarring, skin discoloration, and lasting damage. But smoothness was considered worth chemical burns and permanent skin damage. The underlying message couldn't be clearer. Natural female bodies were inappropriate, unacceptable, fundamentally wrong. Beauty required extensive modification, transformation of the natural into artificial through persistent pain and chemical intervention. Corseted breathing, structural violence against the body, with skin poisoned white and hair systematically removed, attention turned to reshaping the body's actual structure through mechanical compression. Renaissance corsets weren't the extreme wasp-waisted constructions of Victorian era, those would come later. But they were nonetheless genuinely restrictive, using materials like whalebone, wooden stays, reeds, or stiffened cardboard sewn into multiple fabric layers and laced tightly across the back or front. The goal wasn't dramatic hourglass curves, but rather a smooth, cone-shaped silhouette. Corsets flattened breasts rather than enhancing them, straightened the spine into rigid verticality, and created an elongated appearance more architectural than anatomical. The construction itself was engineering. Channels sewn into fabric held rigid stays that prevented the garment from bending. The entire structure was designed to restrict movement and enforce posture. Getting into a properly fitted corset required assistance. You couldn't lace yourself adequately. Servants or family members pulled laces while the wearer held furniture for support and tried not to panic as breathing became increasingly difficult. Once corseted, normal breathing became impossible. The diaphragm couldn't expand properly, lungs couldn't inflate fully. Each breath was shallow and inadequate. Deep breathing, the kind your body naturally wants when climbing stairs or dancing, simply couldn't happen. This wasn't accidental or unfortunate side effect, this was intentional design. Difficulty breathing signified proper corseting. If you could breathe comfortably, your corset wasn't tight enough. You weren't fashionable, you were slack. The resulting shortness of breath Frequent dizziness and occasional fainting were markers of successful fashion adherence. Fainting itself became romanticized in ways that now seem disturbing. The delicate woman, overcome by emotion or minor exertion, gracefully collapsing into male arms, this was portrayed as feminine ideal. In reality, she was oxygen-deprived due to deliberate chest compression, her brain receiving insufficient oxygen. But this physiological truth was less poetic than the fantasy of extreme feminine sensitivity and fragility. Moral and social dimensions were explicitly attached to corsetry. Straight, upright posture indicated inner virtue, self-control, and proper breeding. Slouching or relaxed posture suggested moral laxity, poor discipline, insufficient refinement. The corset didn't just shape bodies, it allegedly shaped character, or at minimum performed it convincingly. Lower-class women generally couldn't afford elaborate corsets and wore looser garments permitting actual movement and work. Ironically, this meant poor women had better posture, no constant external support weakening core muscles, fewer back problems, better bone density, and could breathe properly. Yet they were considered less refined precisely because their bodies functioned normally. The long-term health effects were severe. Constant compression deformed rib cages, sometimes permanently. Internal organs were displaced and compressed into unnatural configurations. Digestion was impaired. Blood circulation was restricted. Muscles weakened from never working against natural resistance. Women who wore corsets from youth often couldn't stand upright without them. Their bodies had literally adapted to external structural support. Dining while dying, performing femininity at meals, a woman poisoned by lead, hairless through aggressive removal, and corseted until breathing was difficult still needed to maintain social appearances. This included attending elaborate banquets, theatrical productions of wealth and refinement. Renaissance feasts were spectacular affairs. Tables literally groaned under roasted peacocks displayed in full plumage, gilded fruits that were more art than food, marzipan sculptures depicting biblical scenes, dishes requiring days of preparation by teams of cooks. These meals demonstrated wealth, hospitality, and refined taste. Attending and being seen at them demonstrated social status and connection. But actually, eating presented enormous problems when your corset prevented your stomach from expanding, and social rules demanded you appear delicate and uninterested in food. The solution was performance dining, an elaborate theatre of eating where you consumed almost nothing while maintaining the appearance of participation. Women learned to take tiny bites that barely qualified as food consumption, eating so slowly that hours passed with minimal intake, focusing on conversation and appearance rather than nutrition. Proper technique required maintaining perfect posture. The corset enforced this whether you wanted it or not, taking delicate bites using only fork tips, chewing thoroughly to extend eating time, and never, under any circumstances, appearing genuinely hungry. Showing appetite was vulgar and lower class. Eating with visible enjoyment suggested you lacked refinement and weren't accustomed to abundant food, marking you as nouveau riche at best, peasant descended at worst. Meanwhile, men at the same tables reclined comfortably, drank heavily, ate until uncomfortable, and engaged in boisterous conversation, behaviors not just permitted but encouraged as signs of healthy masculine appetite and vitality. The double standard was explicit and unapologetic. Male appetite was natural, female appetite was shameful. Some women dealt with this impossible situation through what we'd now recognize as disordered eating patterns. After enduring public meals where they consumed almost nothing, performing delicate disinterest while actually starving, they retreated to private chambers and devoured hidden food stores once corsets were removed. This pattern of public restriction and private binging would be diagnosed as pathological today, but was simply normal adaptive behavior in Renaissance Italy. certain foods were believed to affect complexion in specific ways. Cucumbers supposedly made skin watery, whatever that meant in Renaissance medical theory, so they were avoided. Wine flushed cheeks attractively, lending color to ceruse white faces, so it was encouraged and consumed regularly. Some women drank vinegar tonics specifically to stay thin, despite these tonics' harmful effects on digestive system linings and tooth enamel. Digestion while corseted ranged from uncomfortable to agonizing. The compressed stomach had severely limited capacity and severely compromised ability to process food normally. Women frequently experienced acid reflux, indigestion, bloating, nausea, and constipation, conditions that couldn't be discussed in polite society because bodily functions were absolutely taboo topics for refined ladies. The comprehensive message was consistent across all these practices. Female bodies in their natural state were problematic, excessive, inappropriate. They needed control, restriction, minimization, and concealment. Perfumed clouds, scent, as social necessity. Having addressed skin, hair, shape, and sustenance, Renaissance women turned attention to scent not as luxury, but as absolute social necessity. Personal hygiene in Renaissance Europe was complicated and often inadequate by modern standards. Bathing was infrequent, both due to practical limitations, heating sufficient water was labor-intensive, and medical theories suggesting water could carry disease into the body through open pores. Many physicians actively advised against frequent bathing. As a result, people often smelled distinctly human. Sweat, unwashed clothing, body odors, and various natural scents that modern deodorants and daily showers prevent us from experiencing. For the elite, this was unacceptable. Perfume wasn't luxury or vanity, it was essential protective equipment. Italian perfumers, particularly in Venice, became masters of distillation and import. They worked with exotic ingredients sourced from across the known world. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, ambergris, a waxy substance formed in whale intestines, from distant oceans, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, musk from deer glands, civet from cat-like creatures, rose from Bulgaria and Persia. These weren't delicate, subtle fragrances. Renaissance perfumes were heavy, intense, and applied with generous enthusiasm. They needed to overpower ambient smells, unwashed bodies, poor sanitation, animal waste in streets, rotting food, and general urban funk that characterized pre-industrial cities. Application was thorough and multi-layered. Perfume was soaked into gloves. Scented gloves were luxury items and popular gifts. Dress linings were scented with perfumed waters. Handkerchiefs were drenched in fragrance and waved strategically whenever someone less hygienic approached, which was frequently. Skin received direct application of oils and waters. Hair was treated with aromatic preparations. Even the rare baths incorporated perfumed substances. Pomanders, decorative perforated metal balls or containers, hung from belts or necklaces, releasing continuous scent. These were filled with aromatic mixtures, spices, dried flowers, ambergris, musk. They served double duty as functional scent delivery and visible wealth display, since good pomanders were expensive. Some perfume formulations were genuinely hazardous. Alcohol-based perfumes could contain such high concentrations that they caused skin irritation and allergic reactions. Some included turpentine or other harsh solvents. Certain musk compounds, especially in concentration, could trigger headaches, nausea, breathing difficulties, and fainting. Adding another reason, women might collapse at social gatherings beyond corset-induced hypoxia. The goal was creating an olfactory bubble, a zone of expensive fragrance surrounding you that announced your presence before arrival and lingered after departure. Scent became social territory, invisible but unmistakable marking of status and refinement. Poor people smelled human, sweat, labor, animals, earth. Rich people smelled like imported luxuries, exotic resins, rare flowers, precious animal secretions. The difference was literally breathtaking and effectively impossible to fake. Truly expensive perfumes cost enormous sums, making them effective class markers no amount of clever presentation could counterfeit. Fabric as fortune. Wearing literal wealth. Renaissance fashion wasn't about style alone. It was about displaying wealth so ostentatiously that everyone instantly understood your social position and economic power. Velvet was royal fabric in the most literal sense. Deep, rich, produced through complex weaving techniques, and dyed with costly pigments, velvet was absurdly expensive. Wearing velvet in summer heat was physically uncomfortable, but socially essential. Discomfort proved you could afford impracticality. Brocade escalated further, incorporating patterns woven with metallic threads, actual gold and silver wire woven into fabric. Some gowns featured elaborate religious scenes or heraldic symbols rendered in precious metals. These weren't just expensive, they were portable wealth displays, sometimes worth more than houses. Colors carried specific meanings and costs. Deep blues required lapis lazuli, crushed semi-precious stone imported from Afghanistan. Rich crimsons used cochineal insects imported from the Americas after their discovery. These pigments cost more annually than most craftsmen earned, making specific colors effectively restricted by economics to the wealthy elite. Sumptuary laws in various Italian cities attempted restricting certain colors, fabrics, and styles to appropriate social classes. Florence, Venice, and other cities passed detailed regulations about who could wear what, but enforcement was inconsistent, and wealthy merchants often simply paid fines rather than dress more modestly. The fines were cheaper than losing social standing. Sleeves became a particular focus of competitive display. Detachable sleeves, separate pieces that attached to gowns, allowed wealthy women to own extensive sleeve collections, mixing and matching them with different gowns. These weren't practical considerations, this was conspicuous consumption at its most refined. Embroidered sleeves, puffed sleeves, slashed sleeves revealing contrasting fabrics, pearl-encrusted sleeves, sleeves so elaborate they needed their own storage systems and occasionally dedicated servants to manage them. A single noble woman's complete wardrobe could easily cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in 10 years. And noble women couldn't repeat outfits at social events without risking severe social consequences. Wearing the same gown twice suggested either poverty or stinginess, both social death sentences. The economic pressure was intense and deliberately impossible for anyone below the elite to sustain. Even undergarments were elaborate. Layers of petticoats, chemises, and underskirts were crafted from fine materials and decorated extensively despite being barely visible. The logic was that true quality didn't require external validation. It existed in hidden details that only intimate observers would see. This simultaneously demonstrated wealth, spending on unseen items, and refinement, caring about quality everywhere, not just visible surfaces. Footwear, elevated to dangerous extremes. Renaissance. Women's relationship with footwear reached bizarre and genuinely dangerous extremes with chopines, platform shoes that transformed walking into hazardous athletic performance. Chopines originated practically in Venice, designed to lift expensive gowns above streets filled with mud, sewage, and waste. Reasonable goal. But fashion transformed utility into something else entirely. Heights escalated dramatically. Platform soles grew taller, 6 inches, 10 inches, 15 inches, occasionally to reaching 20 inches or more, effectively stilts disguised as shoes. Women wearing extreme chopines couldn't walk unassisted. Servants physically supported them on each arm, essentially carrying them while maintaining the pretense that the woman was walking independently. The fashion spread beyond Venice, though Florentine and Roman versions were typically less extreme. Still, wearing elevated platforms became definitive status symbol. Height literally correlated with social status. The taller your shoes, the wealthier you appeared. The more servants you could afford, the less you needed actual mobility. The impracticality was the entire point. If you could afford complete inability to walk independently, you were demonstrating that mobility was unnecessary. Walking was for peasants. Servants would support you, carry you, or bring whatever you needed. Independent ambulation was déclassé. Indoor shoes provided different challenges. Delicate slippers, velvet, heavily embroidered, sometimes fur-lined, were meant for indoor wear exclusively. These weren't designed for any actual walking. And they were decorative foot coverings that happened to be shoe-shaped. For outdoor wear, wooden or cork platforms called pattens were strapped underneath slippers to protect them from street filth. This created a two-shoe system: decorative slipper as the real shoe, protective platform underneath. Navigating this arrangement without tripping required practice and constant attention. The result was women dressed in pounds of expensive fabric, faces poisoned white by lead, corseted until breathing was difficult, and elevated on platforms making independent movement impossible. The comprehensive message: wealthy women were decorative objects, not functional humans. Mobility, comfort, and practical capability were irrelevant. Appearance was everything. Foot binding wasn't European practice, but pressure for dainty, small feet was intense nonetheless. Shoes were pointed and extremely narrow, not designed for actual comfortable use. The goal was visual delicacy, regardless of physical consequences. Comfort was for servants and peasants. Dancing while dying, grace under impossible conditions. After being painted, plucked, corseted, and elevated, Renaissance women attended balls where they were expected to dance gracefully, performing elegance while their bodies struggled for oxygen. Court dances were formal, meticulously choreographed affairs. Pavans, galliards, and similar dances required precise footwork, proper posture, and sustained elegance, while corset-restricted lungs tried desperately to supply oxygen to exerting muscles. Every movement carried meaning and faced judgment. Hand placement mattered enormously. Too high appeared presumptuous, too low seemed slovenly. Eye contact had explicit rules governing when, how long, and with whom eye contact was appropriate. Even breathing had etiquette. Breathing audibly through your mouth appeared undignified and desperate, suggesting you lacked the conditioning and refinement proper ladies supposedly possessed naturally. Women practiced extensively with professional dance masters, learning not just steps but entire behavioral systems. How to glide rather than walk. Chopins made actual walking impossible anyway. How to turn without losing balance while elevated and corseted. How to gesture gracefully despite restricted movement. How to maintain conversation while oxygen deprived and exerting significant physical effort. The goal was projecting effortless control, appearing as though all this were completely natural and easy, requiring no particular effort or causing any discomfort whatsoever. Showing strain indicated insufficient breathing or inadequate preparation. Dancing offered rare opportunities for limited interaction with eligible men, precious moments where arranged marriages might be negotiated or avoided. Gloved hands touched briefly during certain movements. Eyes met during prescribed moments in choreography. Perfumes mingled. These were calculated performances of carefully constrained availability. But flirtation had rigid boundaries. Say too much, move too boldly, laugh too freely, or, heaven forbid, show genuine enthusiasm, and you risked ruining your entire aesthetic of pious elegance. The ideal was mysterious, reserved, and utterly controlled. Meanwhile, constant judgment formed the background noise of every event. Other women critiqued your gown, makeup application, dance technique, and any perceived social missteps. Servants whispered observations to their employers. Matrons watched continuously for any impropriety or social error. Every second was surveillance. Women fainted regularly at balls and social gatherings, sometimes from genuine medical distress, hypoxia, heat, exhaustion, starvation, sometimes strategically to appear delicate and feminine. The distinction blurred because both outcomes were socially acceptable and even desirable. Fainting demonstrated feminine fragility and sensitivity. The nightly removal, ritual undoing. Finally, mercifully, events ended and women returned to private chambers for the extensive removal process, undoing hours of preparation. First came ceruse removal. Linen cloths soaked in rosewater, almond oil, or vinegar were used to gently dissolve lead-based makeup. Scrubbing too vigorously removed skin along with paint, leaving raw, bleeding patches. Many women's faces were permanently scarred from years of this daily cycle, application and removal, each cycle damaging skin further. Hair was unpinned, releasing tension that had built for hours. Hair pieces and false braids were removed. Adhesives used to attach these pieces needed dissolving with herbal preparations. Women often discovered new bald patches from excessive plucking and chemical treatments, permanent damage from pursuing beauty standards. And then came corset unlacing, an experience many women described in near spiritual terms. The moment when breathing became possible again, when ribs could expand fully, produced audible gasps and groans. Some women experienced sharp pain as ribs moved back toward natural positions. Internal organs shifted back to less compressed arrangements. The relief was genuine but mixed with discomfort. Feet were extracted from shoes, revealing crushed, blistered toes. Warm water with lavender or rosemary helped if available. Otherwise, women simply assessed the damage, blisters, bruises, deformed toe joints, and accepted it as beauty's price. Finally came application of oils and ointments, preparations promising to preserve youth and repair damage. Many contained dubious ingredients, powdered beetles, exotic resins, substances that smelled of old copper and probably did more harm than good. But hope is powerful, and the beauty industry has always understood this. Then at last, sleep. Briefly. Because tomorrow required repeating everything. The underground market, forbidden literature. While women poisoned themselves for beauty, another form of consumption was occurring in Renaissance Italy. Circulation of forbidden books that the Church desperately tried to suppress. The Catholic Church controlled information through the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of banned texts that grew continuously. But prohibition creates desire, and Renaissance readers were voracious for knowledge, entertainment, and titillation. Medical texts offered the first major loophole. Anatomical treatises by Andreas Vesalius and others claimed purely scientific purpose, while featuring detailed illustrations of nude human bodies, particularly female bodies. While officially educational, many readers appreciated these texts for reasons beyond academic anatomy study. These weren't crude drawings, they were artistic, detailed renderings combining medical accuracy with aesthetic beauty. A nude woman might be displayed with chest cavity opened, organs visible, simultaneously educational and, to certain readers, arousing. The juxtaposition of beauty and dissection created peculiar erotic charge. Young men claimed to study these texts for medical education. The dog-eared, worn condition of certain pages suggested additional interests. Since explicit pornography was completely banned, medical texts provided legal access to images of naked bodies. Publishers understood this dual market perfectly. Some editions featured particularly idealized female figures that went beyond strict medical necessity, blending anatomical accuracy with aesthetic enhancement. If questioned about this editorial choice, publishers cited scientific completeness and artistic integrity. Beyond medical texts, love manuals circulated among educated classes, books offering guidance on courtship, flirtation, and romantic pursuit, all disguised as instruction in refined behavior. These manuals taught the art of the meaningful glance, the proper way to compliment a lady without offending her chaperone, strategic sighing as communication method, and appropriate hand placement during slow court dances. They included sample dialogues, essentially Renaissance pickup lines for various social situations. One popular genre was epistolary romance, collections of fictional love letters between imaginary nobles with names like Count Lorenzo and Lady Fiorella. These were meant to model virtuous courtship behavior, but many letters veered suspiciously close to fantasy territory. The tension, longing, and barely restrained passion were palpable. These manuals included miniature poems and riddles, just literary enough to seem cultured, just vague enough to be interpreted as scandalous. Renaissance readers loved double meanings, and love manuals delivered them in elegant, rhyming couplets. There was also practical advice on grooming and preparation. One manual suggested men keep fingernails clean and teeth white so that a woman, when kissed, feels neither scratched nor offended. Others reminded ladies to maintain fresh breath and avoid onions before romantic conversations. Practical, certainly, but not exactly spiritual. While these books didn't depict physical intimacy explicitly, they hinted at it constantly through suggestion and metaphor. That was precisely the point, less about consummation and more about tension, anticipation, and the charged space between propriety and desire. Classical contraband, ancient texts reborn. Ancient Roman texts provided another avenue for forbidden reading, given scholarly legitimacy by classical pedigree while delivering content the Church found troubling. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, was technically a classical text, which granted it some protection. It was also a detailed seduction manual offering practical advice on finding lovers, maintaining relationships, and keeping passion alive through strategic jealousy and calculated absence. Educated Renaissance readers kept Ovid hidden behind religious texts or bound in misleading covers labeled Cicero's Letters or commentaries on Aristotle. Marginalia in surviving copies includes notes like "effective with Cecilia" and "attempt this carefully," evidence these weren't purely academic readings. The Golden Ass by Apuleius provided another example, a Roman novel featuring transformation, lust, talking animals, and mystical experiences. Its mythological framework gave it literary cover while delivering content that was undeniably erotic and irreverent. Arabic and Greek love poetry circulated in elite circles, texts emphasizing sensual pleasure as path to enlightenment or spiritual experience. These were expensive and rare, requiring connections and discretion to obtain. But for those with resources and interest, they were available. Booksellers maintained public inventories of acceptable, approved texts, while keeping locked cabinets of forbidden material in back rooms. The right patron with sufficient gold and discretion could access medical curiosities or private readings, euphemisms that everyone understood perfectly. Some nobles commissioned illuminated manuscripts of these works, expensive, beautiful objects decorated with gold leaf and detailed illustrations. These were luxury items that happened to contain content the Church condemned. Their beauty and cost made them collectible regardless of content. Convent libraries, nuns, and secret reading. Behind convent walls, away from public scrutiny, another literary world existed. Convents were centers of female literacy in Renaissance Italy. Many young women entered religious life not from genuine vocation, but family necessity, too expensive to marry off appropriately, too outspoken to manage conventionally, too educated to waste entirely. Officially, convent libraries contained devotional texts, saints' lives, theological commentaries, and prayer books. Unofficially, nuns were curious, educated women with time, literacy skills, and access to books that wealthy patrons sometimes donated. Marginalia in convent texts reveals interesting reading patterns. Certain passages were underlined repeatedly. Love poetry appeared copied into margins of psalters. Some nuns translated Ovid into vernacular Italian, allegedly for educational purposes and language practice. Anonymous Renaissance love sonnets attributed to courtly ladies may have actually been written by cloistered nuns using writing as escape valve for feelings they couldn't otherwise express. The passionate and melancholic tone fits women separated from the world they described so vividly. Some convents possessed anatomical texts, justified as medical resources, since nuns often served as nurses and healthcare providers. But as we've established, anatomy books had entertainment value beyond strict medical application. One abbess famously defended keeping an illustrated anatomy manual by arguing it helps younger sisters understand temptation and maintain virtue through knowledge. Creative theology indeed. Forbidden texts circulated between trusted sisters through informal lending networks. Pages were memorized and recopied by hand. Knowledge was shared through coded bookmarks, certain ribbon colors indicating content type. Recommendations were whispered during evening prayers or passed through cryptic notes. For many nuns, reading forbidden texts wasn't primarily about sexual desire or romantic longing. It was about freedom. Books offered windows to worlds they couldn't experience, choices they couldn't make, autonomy they'd never possess. Reading was rebellion, small but genuine. Folk magic and love spells, the people's forbidden knowledge. Beyond elite book circulation, another form of forbidden knowledge existed among common women. Practical magic, folk remedies, and love spells passed orally and in handwritten collections. Grimoires, herb manuals, and charm books circulated among midwives, healers, and cunning women, practitioners of folk medicine and magic who served communities the formal medical establishment ignored. These texts blended botanical knowledge, folk wisdom, and magical thinking in ways that made perfect sense within their worldview. Love spells were particularly popular and feared. Instructions for winning affection, causing desire, ensuring fidelity, or breaking unwanted attachments appeared in countless variations. Most involved sympathetic magic, using physical objects to affect emotional or spiritual states. A typical love spell might require a strand of the beloved's hair, a cup of wine, specific words whispered under full moon, and rose water sprinkled on their pillow. Whether these worked through psychological suggestion, magical mechanisms, or simple hope remains debatable. But they gave women sense of agency in romantic situations they otherwise couldn't control. Aphrodisiac recipes proliferated wildly. Combinations of cinnamon, anise, ground oysters, mandrake root, honey, wine, and various other ingredients promised to awaken Venus's fire. Results varied from placebo effect to actual poisoning, depending on ingredients and proportions. Women were primary keepers and transmitters of this knowledge, passing recipes from mother to daughter through oral tradition and occasional written records. In rural areas where priests visited infrequently and formal medicine was unavailable or unaffordable, these women provided healthcare, counseling, and hope. But the knowledge was genuinely dangerous. The Inquisition viewed women with extensive botanical expertise suspiciously. Healing herbs and love spells existed on a continuum, Today's remedy could become tomorrow's evidence of witchcraft depending on outcomes and accusations. A love spell was a witch trial waiting to happen. Successful healing made you valuable but suspect. Failed treatments could bring accusations of deliberate harm. The margin between helpful wise woman and condemned witch was terrifyingly thin, so pages were hidden in false-bottomed chests, burned when authorities approached, or disguised as household recipe collections. Women memorized rather than wrote, traded information through trusted networks only, and maintained plausible deniability about anything that could be interpreted as magic. The printing revolution, erotica, goes commercial. The printing press fundamentally changed forbidden literature, transforming it from rare manuscripts to reproducible commodities. Gutenberg may have printed Bibles first, but printers quickly realized that forbidden content sold extremely well and commanded premium prices. Venice became the European center for this underground market, with its combination of wealth, relative political freedom, and international trade connections. I Modi, the positions, represented a watershed moment, explicit engravings by Marcantonio Raimondi, with poetry by Pietro Aretino, depicting 16 sexual positions in artistic detail. This wasn't subtle suggestion or classical allusion, this was direct, explicit, and shocking. The Church's response was immediate and severe, banning the work, seizing printing plates, arresting Raimondi. But the damage, or innovation, depending on perspective, was done. The concept of printed erotica had escaped containment and couldn't be suppressed completely. Underground presses sprang up across Europe, producing slim volumes of erotic poetry, scandalous tales, and sometimes outright pornography. These weren't mass-produced, production runs were small, prices high, and distribution limited to wealthy patrons with specific interests and sufficient discretion. Printers developed clever evasion tactics. False title pages made books appear to be something innocuous. Commentaries on Plato might actually contain erotic sonnets. Fake publication locations suggested books were printed elsewhere, Constantinople or Alexandria, when actually produced in Venice or Lyon. Vague Latin titles obscured actual content from casual observers. Some books were bound to resemble religious texts or philosophy when shelved. Only opening them revealed their true nature. This allowed plausibly deniable ownership, if discovered, claim it was misfiled or purchased in error without examining contents. For sufficient payment, printers would create custom content tailored to specific patron requirements, essentially commissioned erotica before the modern industry existed. Wealthy individuals could specify scenarios, characters, and explicit details they wanted rendered in print and illustration. Conclusions on Renaissance beauty and books. Renaissance Italy reveals a culture obsessed with appearance, control, and hidden desires operating under intense religious and social surveillance. Women endured extreme physical harm pursuing beauty standards, serving male pleasure and class distinction. Lead poisoning, corset damage, starvation, chemical burns, and constant pain were normalized as necessary feminine sacrifices for social success and marriage prospects. Simultaneously, forbidden books circulated in shadows, medical texts with erotic undertones, love manuals teaching flirtation as art form, classical texts reborn with new audiences, and eventually printed erotica that bypassed church censorship through clever disguise and underground distribution. Both phenomena reflected power structures. Bodies were controlled through beauty standards that made natural female forms unacceptable. Minds were controlled through censorship, making certain knowledge forbidden. Women navigated both restrictions with varying degrees of success and suffering. But the irony is striking. Women poisoned their bodies to appear beautiful while secretly reading books about desire, autonomy, and alternative possibilities. The contradiction was unsustainable but persisted for centuries because social pressure, economic necessity, and religious authority all reinforced it. Part 3. Edo, Japan and the Art of Pain. From Punishment to Expression, the Transformation of Tattooing. Now we travel east to Edo period Japan, 1603–1868, where tattoos underwent remarkable transformation from criminal brands into elaborate art forms representing honor, identity, and community. Originally, tattoos in Japan served as punishment, permanent marks applied to criminals' visible body parts, faces, arms, hands, to identify them as outcasts permanently. And these weren't artistic or voluntary, they were deliberate social stigmatization through permanent disfigurement. But something shifted during the Edo period. Those marks meant to shame gradually became reclaimed as art. What began as punishment evolved into intricate full-body tattoos that were actually badges of honor in certain communities outside mainstream society. Edo society under the Tokugawa shogunate was rigidly hierarchical. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated appearance based on class position. Samurai had privileges and distinctive clothing. Merchants had wealth but faced restrictions on display. Laborers had neither. For lower classes unable to display status through clothing or possessions, which were literally illegal for them, tattoos offered alternative expression. If you couldn't wear brocade publicly, you could wear it permanently on your skin, hidden under plain work clothes but revealed in bathhouses, festivals, and intimate settings. Full-body tattoos called irizumi or horimono flourished underground as both art form and identity statement. These weren't random designs, but carefully planned narratives covering torsos, arms, and legs with mythological scenes, protective deities, natural imagery, and folklore characters. The hikeishi, fire, brotherhood, and ink. Edo was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. Wooden buildings packed tightly together, open flames for lighting and cooking, limited firefighting technology. Fires were constant catastrophes that could destroy entire neighborhoods in hours. The hikeishi firefighting brigades weren't modern firefighters with hoses and protective equipment. They carried hooks, axes, and exceptional courage. Their job wasn't extinguishing fires, mostly impossible with available technology, but creating fire breaks by demolishing structures in the flames' path. This meant climbing onto burning rooftops and dismantling buildings by hand while embers rained down and heat was intense enough to blister skin. The work demanded extraordinary toughness, quick decision-making, and willingness to risk death regularly. Naturally, these men developed intense brotherhood and distinctive culture. Tattoos became central to hikeishi identity, not vanity, but armor and proof of commitment. Full-body tattoo suits featuring dragons, tigers, and protective Buddhist deities weren't decoration, they were spiritual protection and identity markers. The symbolism mattered deeply. Dragons for power and protection, tigers for courage, Buddhist figures like Fudo-myu for spiritual strength in facing danger. But the pain of getting tattooed was equally important as the final design. Sitting for hundreds of hours while needles punctured skin demonstrated the same courage required for firefighting. If you could endure tattooing sustained pain, you could face infernos without flinching. Some brigades coordinated their tattoos, creating matching themes across all members, identical dragons on backs or coordinated wave patterns down arms. This reflected unity forged through shared danger, marking teams visually just as modern firefighters wear matching uniforms. These tattoos weren't displayed publicly. Authorities frowned on them despite firefighters' heroic status. But in bathhouses after shifts or during celebrations, hikeishi revealed their ink with pride. They were local heroes whose tattoos proved commitment to community protection. The bakuto, gamblers, outcasts, and identity beyond firefighters Another group embraced irizumi enthusiastically, the Bakuto, professional gamblers living on society's margins. Bakuto roamed Japan with dice and cards, operating in legal grey areas and red light districts. They had no formal organization initially, but lived by codes emphasizing loyalty, toughness, and honor among outcasts. In a society that marginalized them, tattoos became identity reclamation and defiance. Their designs were bold and provocative: peonies, fierce warriors, fortune gods, snakes covering torsos in dramatic compositions. These weren't quiet contemplations, they were power statements, declaring independence from social conventions. Many designs referenced folklore and kabuki theater, heroes like Sakata Kintoki, or rebels who challenged authority. The more outrageous the character, the more admired the tattoo. This wasn't subtle symbolism, it was explicit branding, visual autobiography for people society refused to acknowledge. Despite outsider status, Bakuto filled economic niches society needed. They lent money when formal institutions wouldn't, maintained order in pleasure districts where official law was absent, and developed proto-yakuza structures that would eventually evolve into modern organized crime. Their tattoos became both badges and warnings: loyalty and protection within the group, danger and distance for outsiders. Getting tattooed by famous masters was honor requiring connections. Enduring the extended pain was proof of toughness that earned respect. For gamblers and rogues, irizumi was more than decoration. It was identity carved through pain, proudly displayed in worlds offering them no legitimate place. Women's ink, love, loss, and hidden rebellion. While male tattoos are well documented, women's tattoos existed more quietly, hidden from official records but present nonetheless. Female tattoos were typically smaller, more discreet, and emotionally charged. Unlike men's mythological bodysuits, women's ink was often romantic and deeply personal. Love tattoos, irobokuro, were common among lovers, couples tattooing each other's names on hidden body parts, inner arms, inner thighs, near collarbones. A popular phrase was, "I entrust you with my life." More than simple vow, it was commitment literally written in pain and permanence. This practice was especially common in pleasure districts where courtesans and geisha worked. For high-ranking courtesans, small tattoos became seduction tools, marks visible only when robes slipped in intimate moments, creating illusions of exclusive intimacy. In reality, the same tattoo might be shown to multiple clients, each believing it was private secret, shared only with them. Some courtesans maintained multiple love tattoos for different regular clients, a form of emotional manipulation through permanent ink. Tattoos also marked heartbreak and betrayal. A courtesan might burn or slash over a name tattooed on her body after a lover abandoned her, turning passion into scarred testimony. Some covered old names with new ink, dragons swallowing former lovers' names, waves washing memories away. Outside pleasure districts, ordinary women sometimes got tattoos inspired by artistry or solidarity with tattooed husbands and lovers. Though they risked social judgment, these women wore their ink privately as silent declarations of autonomy and resistance to conventional expectations. While Edo society officially condemned female tattooing, these hidden marks carved out narrative space, stories of love, agency, loss, and quiet rebellion that official histories never recorded. The horishi, masters of pain and art. Behind every stunning bodysuit stood a horishi, tattoo master, working anonymously in tucked-away studios, preserving and advancing an art form society officially condemned. Becoming horishi required years of apprenticeship under established masters. Tools were remarkably simple: wooden handles with steel needle clusters attached, dipped in sumi ink made from soot and animal glue. The technique, tebori, involved rhythmic hand jabbing, sometimes assisted by bamboo mallets tapping the needle assembly. The process was excruciating and extraordinarily slow. Single outlines took many hours. Full bodysuits required years of regular sessions, sometimes a decade or more, of sustained work and pain endurance. But Horishi weren't merely technical craftsmen, they were storytellers, historians, and psychologists. Understanding not just how to tattoo, but what to tattoo required deep cultural knowledge. Every design carried layered meanings that needed matching to the client's life, personality, and social position. Clients returned repeatedly over years, building relationships with their horishi that went beyond commercial transactions. Masters decided composition, balance, and narrative flow. The client might request certain elements, but the horishi determined how everything fit together aesthetically and symbolically. Some horishi signed work subtly within designs, hidden in dragon scales, lotus petals, or wave patterns, signatures recognizable only to those who knew where to look. These hidden marks became badges of artistic pride and markers of specific lineages and styles. Despite intimate nature of their work, horishi lived outside mainstream society. Their clientele were firefighters, gamblers, courtesans, people already marginal. So artists, too, existed on edges, revered in underground communities, but invisible to official power structures. But the pain, meaning through endurance. Irezumi wasn't something you wore casually, it was something you survived, earning through sustained pain endurance. Tebori was brutal by design, not accident. Artists would tap needle clusters rhythmically into skin thousands of times, creating wounds that needed healing before continuing. Single sessions lasted half days or longer. Full bodysuits required years. There were no painkillers, no numbing agents, no comfort measures, only the sound of tapping and relentless sensation of repeated puncturing. The pain was absolutely the point, separating committed individuals from casual interest. It was test of will, patience, mental control, and dedication. Clients didn't just receive tattoos, they earned them through suffering. The endurance required became its own form of honor, discussed with quiet pride in bathhouses and sake houses. Firefighters believed agony, strength and courage needed for their work. Gamblers viewed it as loyalty test and proof of toughness. There was genuine spiritual dimension too. Enduring sustained pain resembled Buddhist ascetic practices like extended fasting or meditation, methods for transcending ordinary consciousness and achieving transformation. Buddhist themes appeared frequently in Irezumi, not just aesthetically but philosophically, reflecting ideas about suffering, impermanence, and enlightenment achieved through ordeal. Explicit rules govern behavior during sessions: no flinching, no crying out, minimal movement. Moving too much during application ruined designs or earned stern rebuke from horishi. Only truly committed clients completed full bodysuits. Munawari, with chest panels deliberately left blank so tattoos stayed hidden when robes opened in public. In a world where elites wore silk and status, the tattooed wore pain and permanence as their distinctive markers. Symbolism. Living mythology. Every element in Edo tattoos told stories through carefully chosen symbols carrying multiple layers of meaning. Koi fish swimming upstream represented strength, determination, and willingness to face impossible odds. According to legend, koi that reached waterfall tops transformed into dragons, perfect metaphor for individuals trying to transcend limited circumstances and prove themselves despite society's restrictions. Dragons weren't Western fire breathers but Eastern protectors, spiritual guardians deeply tied to natural forces. Dragons coiling across backs weren't meant to intimidate enemies. They were shields, constant unseen presence providing protection between skin and world. Peonies symbolized bravery combined with beauty. Tigers represented ferocity and resolve. Waves meant life's unpredictability and constant change. Demons and ghosts served as warnings, cautionary tales inked permanently as reminders of dangers lurking in physical and spiritual realms. Many tattoos depicted complete scenes from Chinese and Japanese folklore, battles, divine interventions, tragic romances. Popular subjects included the Suikoden, water margin, Chinese epic about 108 outlaw heroes. These stories resonated powerfully with the tattooed class, rebels, protectors, and misfits who didn't fit samurai ideals but still lived by honor codes. Buddhist deities appeared frequently, especially wrathful protectors like Fudo Mu. Immovable wisdom king depicted with sword in one hand, rope in the other, binding demons and cutting through ignorance. Having him tattooed on your back was like carrying spiritual bodyguard who didn't mind getting violent when protecting you. Placement, size, direction, and sequencing all carried meaning. Tigers climbing upward suggested ambition and striving. Downward movement might warn of dangers or past struggles. The order in which sections were tattooed said something about personal journey and priorities. These symbols were sacred, private, and powerful. In societies where words could betray you and official identity was constrained, tattoos became the most honest form of expression available. Stigma, suppression, and survival. As Edo period progressed, Irizumi's vibrant underground culture increasingly collided with government paranoia and shifting social attitudes. The turning point came when tattoos became associated primarily with Bakuto and emerging criminal organizations. As these groups organized more formally and tattoos began marking membership explicitly, public perception shifted dramatically. To authorities, tattoos signaled criminality regardless of actual meaning. Your dragon symbolizing courage or your koi representing perseverance didn't matter to police and officials. Visible tattoos meant danger, deviance, and probable criminal association. Government responses escalated. By early 1800s, tattooing was officially outlawed in many areas, though enforcement varied by region and local authorities' priorities. Tattoo parlors moved deeper underground. Horishi worked in greater secrecy. Clients used coded language for appointments and relied on trusted referrals. Stigma wasn't merely legal but deeply social. Visibly tattooed individuals were refused entry to public bathhouses, barred from temples, and denied marriages by respectable families. Tattoos became taboo, art form recast as vulgar, dangerous, and fundamentally incompatible with respectable society. But tattoos didn't disappear, they went deeper underground, literally under skin and figuratively into more secretive subcultures. For every official crackdown, there were new designs, innovative hiding strategies, and clients still willing to endure pain for meaningful permanent expression. Modernization, shame, and resistance. The Meiji Restoration, 1868, brought dramatic transformation. Japan's new government desperately wanted Western approval and recognition as modern civilized nation equal to European powers. In this context, tattoos were profoundly embarrassing, something savage that horrified foreign diplomats and made Japan seem backward. So government doubled down. Tattooing wasn't merely criminal but shameful, a practice incompatible with modern, civilized Japan the government was trying to project internationally. Yet ironically, while banned for Japanese citizens, tattooing became tourist attraction. British and American sailors actively sought out horishi to acquire exotic Oriental body art as souvenirs and status symbols. The very art form Japan tried desperately to bury was preserved and spread internationally by foreigners whose approval Japan craved. Horishi adapted to survive. They changed clientele toward foreign customers, moved studios into even deeper secrecy, and passed knowledge through increasingly careful lineages. master-apprentice relationships became more selective and secretive. Techniques, symbolism, and tools were transmitted within families or extremely tight artistic circles. By 20th century, Irezumi became deeply entangled with Yakuza, Japanese organized crime syndicates. Full bodysuits hidden beneath business suits symbolized loyalty and inspired fear within criminal underworld. The art persisted but lost its broader cultural legitimacy, becoming almost exclusively associated with criminality. Even today, stigma lingers powerfully. Despite worldwide interest in tattoo culture and growing appreciation for Japanese tattooing's artistic merit, Japan itself still views tattoos with deep suspicion. Public bathhouses, gyms, beaches, and many businesses ban tattooed individuals. Criminal association fears persist even when ink is obviously artistic or personal rather than gang-related. But times are shifting gradually. Young Japanese artists increasingly reclaim Irezumi as cultural heritage rather than criminal marker. Museums preserve historic designs and study tattooing's cultural significance. Art lovers and historians acknowledge craftsmanship and cultural importance. New generations question why they should be ashamed of artistic traditions with centuries of history. In culture built on layers of clothing, meaning, social roles, and careful silence, Irezumi remains Japan's most direct, honest expression, art form the culture tried hardest to hide but couldn't completely suppress. Epilogue: the human constant. Three distinct cultures, separated by millennia and geography, united by single, undeniable truth. Humans have always sought transformation beyond what biology alone provides. Ancient Egyptians pursued divine connection and transcendence through substances altering consciousness: blue lotus, beer, kai-fi, wine, mandrake, cannabis, opium. They developed sophisticated systems integrating these substances into religious practice, medical treatment, and social celebration. Renaissance Italians pursued aesthetic perfection through modifications that destroyed bodies systematically: lead cosmetics, aggressive hair removal, restrictive corseting, starvation disguised as refinement. They sacrificed health, comfort, and ultimately life itself for beauty standards serving status competition and social survival. Edo Japanese pursued identity and belonging through permanent body modification requiring sustained pain endurance, elaborate tattoos marking community membership, personal narratives, and spiritual protection in society offering them no legitimate recognition. The methods differed dramatically across cultures, but the underlying impulse was identical: transcending ordinary existence, becoming something more than unmodified biology provides, expressing identity and meaning through transformation. We might judge these practices as foolish, dangerous, or excessive from our modern perspective. But we engage in remarkably similar transformations using contemporary methods: cosmetic procedures, pharmaceutical interventions, body modifications, consciousness-altering substances, and extensive personal branding through appearance management. The Egyptians weren't primitive drug enthusiasts lacking modern understanding. Renaissance women weren't merely vain victims of patriarchy. Japanese tattoo recipients weren't criminal deviants or masochists. They were humans navigating complex social worlds with available tools, seeking meaning, beauty, belonging, and transcendence through whatever means their cultures provided and their circumstances allowed. Perhaps the real lesson isn't that our ancestors were strange, but that we're remarkably similar despite surface differences. We still pursue altered states. We just call them wellness, self-care, or consciousness expansion now. We still sacrifice comfort for appearance. We just outsource it to medical clinics and call it enhancement. We still mark our bodies permanently. We just have better needles, anesthetics, and social acceptance in certain contexts. The sacred smoke still rises, just from different sources. The forbidden pages still circulate, just digitally rather than on vellum. The painful ink still flows, just with modified techniques and different cultural meanings. Human nature doesn't fundamentally change across time, only the specific expressions evolve. The drive to transform, transcend, and express identity through body and consciousness modification appears to be genuinely universal across cultures and eras. So before we judge ancient Egyptians for their festival of drunkenness, or Renaissance women for their lead cosmetics, or Edo Japanese for their painful tattoos, perhaps we should examine our own transformation practices with the same critical eye. Are our methods genuinely wiser or merely different? Do our frameworks serve us better or just serve different purposes? Thank you for joining this extensive exploration across time, geography, and human experience, wherever you are in the world. Whatever time it is as you engage with this, remember, you're part of this long human story of transformation, beauty, pain, and transcendence that stretches back millennia and will likely continue millennia forward. If this journey resonated with you, consider subscribing to continue these conversations, and please leave a comment sharing which historical practice surprised you most or made you think differently about contemporary life. These discussions are valuable because they connect us across time and space, creating dialogues our ancestors could never have imagined but would certainly recognize. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and maybe reconsider before judging too harshly the choices people made in circumstances very different from our own. We're not nearly as different from them as we might prefer to believe.